Hey Table Rock, welcome back to Life Groups. As we begin to look at the end of Acts 15 and the beginning of Acts 16, I wanted to remind us of what we saw on Sunday. I began with the John Piper quote, and he said, God is always doing 10,000 things, and we might be aware of 3 of them. And in light of our text, I said, we might even get those 3 wrong. But God is always working. Even when we don't understand what he's doing, God is at work. And we saw first then that God is at work even when evil or brokenness seems like it's getting the upper hand. And then we looked that God is at work when our plans are frustrated. God is always at work. So we started by looking at Paul and Barnabas and this disagreement they had on whether they should take John Mark on this proposed trip to go visit all of the churches that they met on their first missionary journey. And they have such a sharp disagreement that they need to separate ways. And it's leaving us with the question, what's God doing? Where is God? Is God too weak to bring these leaders together? And the answer was no. Rather, God is at work. Even when Paul and Barnabas don't understand why they can't agree and why they can't go on this proposed trip, yet God is at work. And what we saw is not 1, but now 2 missionary teams go out. Barnabas and Mark go on the original trip through Cyprus, while Paul and Silas go another direction. And then we saw that the brothers commended Paul and Silas in the grace of the Lord on this new plan. So God was at work. Even when it seemed like evil or brokenness was getting the upper hand, God was doing something. And then we saw that God is at work even when our plans are frustrated. And we zoomed in to Paul and Silas's trip. And as they're traveling, they think it's wise to go over to Asia. The Holy Spirit prevents them. They want to go over to Bithynia. The Holy Spirit prevents them. They get all over to Troas. And finally they realize through a dream that God is calling them to go to Macedonia. And they conclude that the Lord is calling them to preach the gospel there. And we saw that God was at work when their plans were frustrated. God had a plan from the beginning, all the way even back to when Paul and Barnabas separated ways, to take Paul and Silas all the way to Europe, to Macedonia, to preach the gospel, because God wanted the gospel to go there. And we saw that God is just always at work. As we looked at the resolution between Paul and Barnabas, fellow workers, he calls them, in 1 Corinthians. And then we saw the unity between Paul and Mark when Paul asks for Mark to be sent to him in his letter to Timothy. God is always at work. Whether we understand, whether we know what he's doing, whether it seems like evil and brokenness is getting the upper hand, God is at work. So don't lose heart. Don't feel like God has left those in the desert and that he's forgotten about them. No, God is at work. And we saw that God's at work when our plans are frustrated, when we think we know what God's doing, when we think we know what he's called us to. But down the road, we have to change directions. God is at work. God is always working. God is doing 10,000 things. And we might be aware of 3 of them. And we might even get some of the details about those 3 wrong. We might even get those 3 wrong, period. But God is at work. Table Rock, I hope you have a fruitful conversation applying these paragraphs, this text to your life.